Well, you may be a high school, college student, or a parent of a high school or college student sitting in classrooms being taught things about the theory of evolution and trying to understand what's true, what's false. How do I understand this? What if I hold to something like intelligent design, creationism? How do I respond? How do I talk to my classmates, my friends, my teachers, or my professor about it? So here, trying to have this conversation to help you better engage with scientific ideas, with faith, science ideas, and addressing questions on intelligent design and evolution is the conversation today. My name is Ryan Pauly. This is Think Well, the show to train you and help you think well about the Christian and faith and engage the culture well. And joining me is Dr. Casey Luskin. Dr. Casey Luskin has graduate degrees in both geology and law. He's a practicing attorney and a geologist. He works as the Associate Director of Center for Science with the Discovery Institute. And as I said, a practicing lawyer, and really kind of focusing that part of his job on evolution, education in public schools, and defending academic freedom for scientists who face discrimination because of their support for intelligent design. So we're going to be talking about this book that came out a little while ago that he helped co-author with William Densky and Joseph Hold'em, The Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith. Man, if you have science and faith questions, this has 30 plus authors writing on every single type of question you could imagine regarding the science and faith conversation. It is a great, great resource to have. So Casey, thanks for coming on the show and helping us understand this kind of cultural conversation regarding science and faith.
Thanks so much for having me, Ryan. I've been looking forward to this, and I apologize. I'm not in top shape today. I'm actually on the sort of the downward slope of getting over COVID, and I'm also preparing to fly out for about 40 days and a couple days here to go travel and speak internationally. So thankfully, I'm pretty much over my symptoms now. So I think I'm going to be good to travel, but still a little bit fatigued. So hopefully I won't have any COVID brain, but looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you taking this time with me. And, you know, this is horrible timing on my part because we met a year ago at Summit Ministries, which I'm planning to fly out on Friday for Summit. And I'll be there again for 2 weeks. And it's taken me a year to get back and book this interview with you. And so, of course, I book it right as you're getting over COVID and about to travel. So I do appreciate you taking the time to talk through this with us. So, one of the things I want to talk with you about, and kind of my hope is as I'm trying to help people be able to engage the culture, I think you have a lot of experience in this as you are a scientist, a geologist, as well as a practicing lawyer, and helping kind of defend, you know, intelligent design in the classroom with evolution, all that kind of stuff. I think there's a lot of experience that you bring as far as what this looks like at a practical level, the conversations and what's happening, going on in culture. So let's kind of maybe start, and that's where I want to go, but let's start with some definitions. So how would you kind of define intelligent design? What is intelligent design?
Sure. So intelligent design is a scientific theory which holds that many aspects of life in the universe are best explained by an intelligent cause. And we often will say they're best explained by an intelligent cause compared to other potential explanations, such as an unguided mechanism like natural selection. And the reason why intelligent design is the best explanation is because we find features in nature which in our experience have the kind of information and complexity which only comes from intelligence, okay? So let me give you an example of what we're talking about. When we look at the heart of life today, what do we find? Well, we find that in our DNA is a language-based code. We see that the nucleotide bases arranged along the backbone of the DNA molecule are arranged in very particular sequences and orders. And these actually form commands and codes that are very much like a computer language, which is then read and interpreted by our cellular machinery. These commands and codes are literally read and interpreted by machines in the cell, much like the way computer code is read and interpreted by machinery in your computer. And then this language-based code that is in our DNA is being processed through computer-like information processing, and the output of this process is machines. Our cells are actually full of micromolecular machines that are doing all kinds of important functions, including energy production, waste disposal, transportation, recycling, creating protective barriers that let certain things in and keep harmful things out. There's all kinds of machines running around your cells performing vital functions that you need to be able to perform. But the whole point is this. What we see at the heart of life is language-based code, computer-like information processing, and machines. But where in our experience do these sorts of things come from? Where do we see language-based code coming from in our experience? Where does computer information processing come from in our experience? Where do machines come from in all of our experience? These things come only from intelligence. So intelligent design is the best explanation for the presence of language-based computer code like code in our DNA, computer-like information processing that goes on in our cells, and machines that are present in our cells. And I think that that provides a really powerful, positive argument for design, because we're finding in biology the kind of information and complexity which in our experience comes only from intelligence.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm thinking as you're kind of discussing there, a lot of objections that I've heard kind of raised against intelligent design. So what about like one of someone saying, this is just kind of this God of the gap. So we don't know how the complexity got there. So for you to input designer, you to input God, that just gives science more time and they'll figure it out.
So I would say that what I just described is actually the opposite of a God of the gaps argument. The God of the gaps argument says that we're ignorant about where, how certain things happen or the way certain things work or where certain things come from. And we just sort of substitute God for our ignorance, okay? Our lack of knowledge about the way the world works. In the case of intelligent design, first of all, I'm not necessarily making an argument here for God. I am a Christian. I do believe that God, the designer, is the God of the Bible. And I'm very quick to tell people where I'm coming from, whether I'm speaking to a Christian audience or a secular audience or a mixed audience or whatever. I think it's important to just be upfront about where you're coming from. But that's my own personal religious belief. The theory of intelligent design is not telling us necessarily who the designer is. So let's just give a hypothetical example. The information in our DNA that is, written in a language-based code encoding these molecular machines, that information might be screaming out, I need an intelligent cause. But it's not, that information doesn't say made by Yahweh or made by Allah or made by Buddha or made by Yoda or made by whoever you might think the designer is. All it's saying is this is an information-rich code which points to the need for an intelligent cause. And so if I were to go and say that, I believe that the designer is the God of the Bible, that's fine, I can say that. But now I'm going beyond what the scientific evidence can say. And so I'm not claiming, nor do ID theorists ever claim, and at least if they understand what ID is, they don't claim that the theory of intelligent design can actually tell us who the designer is. All the theory of intelligent design can do is tell us that there's evidence for an intelligent cause as far as the designer goes. It's not going to go further and specify for you who the designer is. So I'm trying, as far as the science goes, I'm trying to respect the limits of science, and I'm not claiming that we can determine through the theory of intelligent design, through science, who the designer is. If you want to make an argument that the God of the Bible is the designer, that's fine. But I'm going to use evidence and arguments from fields outside of science, outside of intelligent design, from history and philosophy and theology, etc. I'm not going to use intelligent design if I'm going to try to persuade you that the God of the Bible is the designer, because the scientific evidence simply doesn't tell us who the designer is. But let's now get back to that positive argument. Why is it not a quote unquote gaps-based argument? Well, the reason why is, again, a God of the gaps argument substitutes our lack of knowledge for where things come from and says, it must be God, it must be whatever. Intelligent design does the opposite. We know from our experience where things like language-based digital code, computer-like information processing, or machines, we know where these kinds of things come from. In our experience, they come only from intelligence. So rather than using our ignorance or trying to say we don't know where these things come from, therefore I'm just going to say, God did it, I'm actually saying, no, we do know, based upon our experience, where these things come from. And all of our experience with the origin of a language-based code, of computer-like information processing, the origin of machines, and all of our experience with the origin of those things, it always invariably traces back to a mind or a personal agent. And so intelligent design is basing our inference to design upon our knowledge of the cause and effect structure of the world and our knowledge that certain types of information and complexity only come from intelligence. So I appreciate the God of the gaps objection. I think it's often made in good faith, but it really is based upon a misunderstanding of the kind of argument that we're making here. We're not making an argument based upon what we don't know. We're making an argument based upon what we do know.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems almost similar. It's like, you have a murder scene, right? And you look at the evidence and it points to a suspect, and it's like, well, you just kind of have suspect of the gaps. You have to find someone who did it, and therefore you're pointing at that person. It's like, no, we're not just like, I don't know who did it. It must have been Bob. It's like, no, I have positive evidence that is best explained by an external person. This is not suicide. This is not death by natural causes. You don't get 5 bullet holes in the back of your back by natural causes. This points to a murder. And so there's actual designed, things that we see that look like that point to that conclusion we're coming to. Now,
and I want to add, Ryan, real quick, like any scientific hypothesis or scientific conclusion, we always hold our conclusion tentatively, subject to future discoveries and future investigations. So, and this makes ID no different from any other scientific theory. We hold the conclusion tentatively. So we're always open to new ideas, new evidence, new explanations that might come up. And if those happen to explain the evidence better than, appealing to an intelligent cause, then that's fine. Then we'll go with that. But for now, the best explanation that we have for many of these features is intelligence.
Yeah. Okay. So what you just said there, right there, kind of brings up a thought in my mind, because often with the God of the gaps argument, the claim is made like, well, we didn't know where rain came from. We thought the gods were crying, and then we realized there's, weather patterns, and we didn't know where lightning and thunder came from. We thought, Thor or whatever, Zeus was angry and throwing down lightning bolts, and now we realize why there's lightning and thunder. And so often the examples given for the God of the gaps argument are these like super ancient 2,000 years ago, we didn't understand why there were waves in the ocean, and we thought Poseidon was upset versus Poseidon was happy. What about recently, though? So it's like, okay, clearly 2,000 years ago, we didn't understand things, and we've shown that these kind of supernatural explanations for what was happening in the world are ridiculous, and we've filled that gap, so to speak, with a naturalistic explanation. But are there like recent discoveries? So you say, we hold our views tentatively. Are there discoveries in the last, maybe since ideas started, or since you've been really involved with ID, have there been things that we thought were from God's supernatural explanations that have been disproven and shown a natural cause? Or is that gap shrinking as often claimed? Or actually is maybe the gap of where a designer is needed widening, if that makes sense?
Sure. So look, I just reject gaps-based arguments of all kinds because they tend to assume what the answer is supposed to be. Okay.
Yeah.
And I don't want to make any assumptions. I want to let the data speak for itself. So I can think of many examples where over the last 20, 30, 40 years, science has made new discoveries that supported intelligent design. And I think that the evidence for intelligent design was expanding and growing. But the truth is, scientists have to always be open to being overturned. So as a design theorist, I'm always open to the possibility that the evidence might turn out to support an evolutionary explanation. And intelligent design is not inherently against evolution being the best explanation in many cases. Okay. I mean, what intelligent design is actually doing is it's expanding our explanatory toolkit. Most evolutionary scientists want to limit our claims to strictly unguided natural material causes. And what ID says is, look, natural evolutionary mechanisms are fine. We can invoke those when they're the best explanation. I mean, look at antibiotic resistance. Of course, in those cases, we can see in real time that bacteria are evolving resistance to some kind of an antibiotic drug. Of course, natural selection is a real phenomenon at work in those environments, in those situations. And we can observe other situations at work around the world today where natural selection is a real cause that is actually, at work and causing things to diversify. Okay, fine. In those cases, let's invoke natural evolutionary mechanisms. ID has no problem with this. What ID is saying is that not that natural selections are never the explanation. It's saying that, natural evolutionary explanations aren't necessarily always the explanation in every single case. But that's what the evolutionists are saying. They're essentially saying you have to invoke unguided evolutionary mechanisms in all cases, all the time, now and forevermore. Amen. And you have no intellectual options outside of that very restricted philosophical view that it has to be evolutionary explanations only all the time. And what ID is saying, let's open up ourselves to new possibilities, to the possibility of intelligence. So what I would say actually is far more common today in science, what is far more common than the quote unquote God of the gaps explanation causing problems is that materialism of the gaps causes problems for science today. Far, far more often, where evolutionary scientists insist that you are only allowed to invoke unguided evolutionary mechanisms. And then those explanations turn out to be wrong. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to understand what, the trend of the evidence, what's really going on today in science is not that, quote unquote, the God of the gaps is standing in the way of the progress of science. I think, if anything, it is materialism of the gaps that is causing problems today. I want to read to you, by the way, a quote from a Harvard zoologist named Richard Lewontin. He passed away a few years ago. He basically acknowledged in an article he wrote that evolutionary biology today is committed to materialistic explanations regardless of what the evidence says. I want to read you this quote. And this is, again, a leading scientist, a Harvard zoologist named Richard Lewontin. He said, "Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, he says, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." So what's really going on today, Ryan, in the scientific community is that scientists are committing what I would call materialism of the gaps, where they assume that essentially unguided evolutionary mechanisms are the explanations in all cases, and they are committed to that view before they even come to the table and start looking at the evidence. And to me, this is what is holding back the progress of science, not invoking design when design is the best explanation based upon the evidence we have.
Yeah. No, I think that's such an important point. And one that I try to stress so often with students is that we have to understand the worldviews that are at play regarding this conversation. It's not a Christianity versus science. I often say at my school, and it's like, I don't believe in Christianity, I just believe in science. It's like, well, hey, we teach science at this school. We believe in science too. But what's happening here is it's Christianity or supernaturalism versus naturalism. That there's a worldview at play that is shaping the way that we look at and evaluate what we see as possible options. And if we're fair, if we can remove that worldview, kind of remove our bias, we should be able to have both options on the table. Is there a supernatural explanation or a natural one, and follow the evidence where it leads? And so, have you seen, so kind of going back to that first question, has there been an explanation in your mind in the last few years where it sure looked like it was a supernatural cause? There was a designer, there had to be a designer, and then we found a natural explanation for it by looking at better evidence, or where you were proven wrong. You said, hey, if I am shown wrong, I'll follow the evidence where it leads. Has there been an example recently where you have kind of been proven wrong and had to follow the evidence away from a design theory to more of a naturalistic explanation?
There are certainly cases where we have said, hey, if we're proven wrong, we'll follow the evidence where it leads. And we're open to being proven wrong. But I can't think of an example where ID made a bold prediction that then turned out to be wrong. Now, maybe I'm a little fuzzy brained right now. Like I said, I had COVID last week. I'm on the very, very tail end of it right now, but I'm still a little fuzzy brained. So maybe there's something I'm forgetting. But let me give you a little example of for my own life, of an example where we were saying, look, we're open to being proven wrong, but then actually the evidence ended up vindicating ID. I got involved with the ID debate when I was actually an undergraduate student at the University of California, San Diego, back in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And at that time, I started a student club there called the Intelligent Design and Evolution Awareness Club, or IDEA Club for short, where we tried to create a venue where students could actually have conversations about origins that were typically not allowed to take place in most of our science classes. UC San Diego is a huge science-focused school. It's a great school. I loved it there. But unfortunately, I took many, many science classes, and the vast majority of them really just disallowed us from talking about things like evolution, intelligent design as a sort of a scientific debate. So at this club, we would always have dialogues. We would openly invite evolutionists to come, whether they were undergrads or grad students or even faculty. And we would often get hit over the head with one argument. That argument was basically junk DNA. This was in the late 90s, early 2000s, right around the time that the Human Genome Project came out and showed that, yeah, only about 2 to 3% of our genome is encoding proteins or sort of traditional genes encoding proteins. And people were saying, well, what's the other 97% of the genome doing? Why would a designer put all of this useless junk DNA in our genomes? And under an evolutionary perspective, there was just this assumption that if they didn't know what this DNA did, that it must be the result of millions of years of random evolutionary mutations producing garbage in our genomes that we don't need because it's not encoding proteins. And they would say, look, this is clearly a spectacular refutation of intelligent design, all this non-coding junk DNA in our genomes. And UID people need to reckon with that. And what I would say is this, Ryan, I would say, look, if you guys are right, that actually, 97 or something percent of our genomes turn out to be useless evolutionary genetic junk, then I would actually agree with you guys. I think that would refute intelligent design. Okay, I think that would be a really powerful evidence against intelligent design. So I'll sort of take the premise of your argument and say you've made a fair argument here. The problem is that at that time, and certainly at that time, we didn't know what that other 97% of our DNA was doing. They were assuming it was junk in the absence of evidence. This is materialism of the gaps. In the absence of evidence, we're going to assume that an evolutionary process did this, and it's just evolutionary noise, evolutionary junk. All right. And what I would say in response is I would say, look, the reality is we've barely even begun to understand the non-protein coding parts of our genomes. So I think a more prudent scientific approach would be to let's wait and see. I mean, I'm open to being refuted here. If it turns out that it is in fact useless genetic garbage, then I'll grant you guys that I think this is a huge, piece of evidence against intelligent design. Yeah. But if it turns out that, ID would predict that it is functional, because when intelligent agents make things, they tend to do things for a reason. They tend to make things for a purpose. So if our genome really is the result of design, I would tend to say that we would predict that, by and large, it's going to have function. Okay. And so now what has happened over the last 10, 15 years? Well, in the 2000s, there started to be started as a slow trickle, but more and more papers started to come out discovering function for the quote unquote junk DNA. And then by the late 2000s, there were hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of papers that had been published discovering function for the quote unquote junk DNA. In 2011, Jonathan Wells, a pro-ID biologist, wrote a book called The Myth of Junk DNA, where he cited hundreds and hundreds of papers finding evidence for junk DNA. But then in 2012, the dam broke open. And there was a paper published in the journal Nature from a consortium of hundreds of scientists around the world called ENCODE. And what they found in that paper is that they had detected evidence for biochemical functionality for 80% of our genome. And they actually said the reason it was only 80%, it was because they were only studying about 187 types of cells in the human body. And if they studied certain aspects of our genome are only functional in certain types of cells at certain stages of the life cycle. So they predicted that as we study more and more cell types, that 80% would actually go up to 100%. Now, these were scientists who were not necessarily coming from an ID perspective. They were just trying to figure out how the genome works and what the data says. And they found that the data showed that, that the genome was functional. And since then, there have just been, untold numbers of papers finding function for quote unquote junk DNA. In fact, a paper in Genome Biology and Evolution a few years ago said that, quote, the days of junk DNA are over, unquote. So there's been a huge paradigm shift in biology over the last 10, 20 years, which radically shows that that the quote unquote junk DNA, the non-coding DNA in our genome, actually has crucial functions. And by and large, what that quote unquote junk DNA is doing is it's actually regulating the protein coding DNA. So if you think of building a house, to build a house, you need things like brick, you need wood, you need nails, you need mortar. And that's all the things you need to build a house. But you can't just build a house just having brick and wood and nails and mortar. You also need a blueprint to tell you where to put the brick, where to put the wood, where to put the nails, where to put the mortar, and what order do you put them together? How do you build put all these parts together in a useful way to actually build something that works? Well, in the same way, the junk DNA, the non-coding DNA, functions kind of like the blueprint for the protein coding DNA, and that it is telling your cells when to produce certain proteins, how much to produce, when to stop producing them, how to respond to environmental cues. It's basically the blueprint is in the non-coding DNA, and it controls and regulates gene expression. That's the way biologists put it. So we found that the junk DNA is hugely important, and this is a spectacularly fulfilled prediction, because ID made this prediction prior to the discovery. And there are actually, I know of ID scientists who have done research helping to find function for junk DNA. A lot of other non-ID scientists did as well, but certainly ID scientists were part of it. So we have this opportunity where ID could have been proven wrong. We made a testable prediction. We said that we were open, to seeing what we didn't know what the evidence was going to say, and it turned out that the evidence confirmed the prediction of ID. And I think that this is an example of how ID actually does make good predictions and can function as a successful science.
Yeah, no, I think that's so helpful to hear. And I think it, it does, as you said, kind of shows that ID makes good predictions. I think it's also kind of maybe helpful in the sense of, here's an example of when, a naturalist or evolutionist kind of got something wrong, so to speak. And then there's examples, as we mentioned, of religious people in the past of saying, well, the gods are crying or whatever, and they got it wrong. And so it's like, hey, let's kind of focus in on what's happening now, right? It's not like, hey, you got something wrong, 50 years ago. And I know that's not what you're doing here. You're showing a successful prediction of ID. Or hey, religious people 2,000 years ago got something wrong. You're probably wrong now. It's like, well, hold on. Let's evaluate the evidence now. What is the best scientific evidence that we have now pointing to, and what does that say? And so I think this is helpful. Now, I do want to kind of switch a little bit into kind of the cultural aspect of this, because when I'm reading over your bio and it says, hey, you help, kind of as an attorney fight for academic research freedom, studying, those who study, research, and teach on intelligent design, evolution type stuff. And I know that this conversation often gets kind of heated. I did a video on TikTok when I first started that platform a long time ago, why I think evolution is false. And I got blasted. And I mean, I could have I've written some other controversial things on there. I thought much more controversial and don't get that much of a response. Why is it that this conversation, to come out and say, I think evolution is false, why does it sometimes seem to get so much heat, so much attraction that makes people not want to say anything about it?
Yeah. There's this famous quote from this Chinese paleontologist. And he said, in China, we can criticize Darwin, but not the government. But in America, you can criticize the government, but not Darwin. And I think it's such a great quote, because this issue is such a hot topic. You get in so much trouble as soon as you start to criticize Darwin. Look, I mean, this gets into some complex sociology, as you said. And so, I can't say that there's a one-size-fits-all answer to your question. All right.
Yeah.
I think it's a very complex question, and I think there's a lot of reasons why Darwin is so controversial. But I will say that, for a lot of people, the Darwinian account of the diversification of species, and essentially what it led to, basically a materialistic view of biology, that all of the history of life can be explained in purely unguided naturalistic terms, that this is very, very important to a lot of people in our society today. It basically makes up, for them at least, it functions like a secular creation myth. So you are literally, critiquing their account of their creation myth. So a lot of people don't like that, all right? Because you're critiquing something that's very core to their worldview. Now, I'm not saying these people, of course, I'm sure they believe it in good faith. They think there's good scientific evidence for it. But I think that for some people, that's the reason. Now, that's not the only reason, and that's not true for everybody. Obviously, there are some folks out there who are Christians, who are theistic evolutionists, who believe in the sort of an evolutionary account of the history of life. But let's set that aside for a minute. Let's just talk about scientists in general. Why do scientists sometimes react very strongly when you could critique an evolutionary paradigm? Well, this actually is not so surprising when you think about the history of science and the sociology of science. The famous historian of science, Thomas Kuhn, said in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he said, the word he used was intolerant. He said that scientists are often intolerant of new ideas that are challenging reigning paradigms, okay? So the fact that many scientists kind of put their guard up as soon as you start to touch, this reigning evolutionary paradigm that certainly is dominant in biology today, we shouldn't be surprised, because this is just exactly what leading historian of scientists say is supposed to happen when you challenge the main evolutionary view that is out there, or the main paradigm in some scientific field. And so I don't think we should be so surprised that this is such a controversial topic. Now, one of the things, my heart is to try to diffuse this controversy a little bit, and to try to take some of the heat out of it and bring more light to it. I do believe that this is a topic where reasonable people can disagree. I don't think that my friends and folks that I've known over the years who come from an evolutionary perspective, I don't think they're crazy. I think that they often have many good faith reasons for believing what they believe. And the last thing I would do is to try to attack their characters, their integrity, their education, their knowledge, their intelligence, simply because they believe something that I happen to also disagree with. And I believe that I hold my views also in good faith. I mean, I spent a lot of time in school studying evolution. I have almost enough coursework in evolution to have a degree in the subject. So, I've also done my homework. So I've got my right to hold my views as well. So what I hope this debate or this topic can turn into is a serious scientific conversation rather than one where people are sort of at each other's throats or are attacking each other personally. Far too often on the internet, it really devolves into that. Some of your listeners may have seen the Jim Tour Dave Farina debate that happened a few months ago, back in May of 2023. Well, what happened? Look at the opening lectures, or the opening statements of that debate. You have Jim Tour, who spent his entire opening lecture talking about nothing but the science. Well, he started by actually giving a very nice gift to Professor Dave, but he spent the entire debate, the entire opening statement saying nothing but scientific critiques of the origin of life, talking about the science. And from the opening line, unfortunately, Dave Farina made it very clear that his goal, his reason for being there that night in that debate, was to attack Professor Tour's character and to attack him personally, and made it entirely about a personal attack upon Jim Tour. Now, of course, Professor Dave did get into the science eventually, and we can debate back and forth. But even when he talked about the science, the whole point was simply to attack Professor Jim Tour rather than to simply, say, well, what, in a very calm, serious, collected kind of way, what does the evidence really say? So I wish, I feel bad for Jim Tour. I think that he withstood a lot of venom during that debate, and he did the best he could to sort of take these shots for an hour at his character. Sometimes he did get a little bit irritated, but I don't know anybody who wouldn't get irritated if somebody was basically calling you a liar and a fraud, for an hour and a half, nonstop, basically. But all that being said, we need to move past these kinds of personal attacks in this debate and move towards a place where we can have serious scientific conversations. That's my heart for this debate. That's frankly why I started the Idea Club when I was a student at UC San Diego, was I wanted to create an environment, and this is actually part of our mission statement at that club, to create an environment where everybody felt comfortable to express their views in a warm, friendly environment, whatever their views might be. And we'd have serious conversations that got down to real issues rather than, getting into the emotion of it. So that's my heart. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that, it can't just kind of become crazy. I couldn't finish the debate. I had to turn it off. I'm like, I don't want to listen to this anymore. I'll find something else to dive down into the research on the origin of life debate. But what would you say? I speak mostly to Christian students, but it's not only Christians that kind of are questioning or have questions about evolution. What would you say to like high school students who are sitting there? This is kind of being taught as maybe the only option of what is the explanation for how we got here. Should they engage the teacher? Should they not? Should they ask questions? What would be maybe your advice and what you've seen on how to best go at this as maybe a high school student?
That's a really important question, Ryan. And let me just first say that was my experience. I went to public schools from kindergarten through my master's degree. Okay. So I know what public school kids are going to experience when they study this topic. The vast majority of students in public schools in the United States, at least, are going to receive a pro-Darwin only presentation of the evidence that basically censors any of the scientific evidence that challenges the evolutionary model. Okay. That is unfortunately what you're going to experience. So the first thing you need to realize is you're going to hear a lot of science that you might disagree with, and you're going to hear a lot of claims that frankly are challenged by the scientific evidence and by leading scientists in the mainstream scientific literature. What's literally going on, and I've dealt with this because I've been engaged with public policy debates over teaching evolution in public schools since 2005. What is literally going on is we see that there are folks out there who want to actually censor and I don't use that word lightly. They want to censor from students legitimate, peer-reviewed scientific papers that challenge what is being taught in the textbooks about evolution. Okay, they do not want students to receive that scientific information, even though it's in peer-reviewed scientific journals, even though it's being articulated by mainstream scientists who have legitimate credentials. They want that information censored from students, and that might make you angry. The fact that basically information is being withheld to you. So here's my response. Okay, what to do? First of all, I was never the kind of student who went to class trying to rock the boat. It's just not my temperament. I wasn't the guy who went to class saying, I'm going to stump the teacher today. I'm going to raise my hand and answer the question the teacher can't answer. That's just not my temperament. I went to class to learn. Whether I agreed or disagreed, I went to class to learn. Okay, I wanted to hear what the teacher had to say. I wanted to hear that perspective. And so I would encourage students to do the same, all right? To go to class to learn, to not be disruptive, not to be, a jerk to your teacher. Now, does that mean you can't ask questions? Maybe some students are bolder than I was. Well, that's okay. If you want to ask questions, you can ask questions, but make sure you do your homework first, okay? And make sure you know what you're talking about so that you are able to articulate, in a reasonable way that's actually going to, be attractive to people. And the good news is that I don't think that that's very hard to do. It's not that hard to get educated on this topic. So my first piece of advice is don't be afraid to learn about evolution, okay? Don't be afraid to learn about evolution. And I really mean that. Learn about evolution when you're given the opportunity. But my second piece of advice is when you learn about evolution, don't just take everything you're saying that they're being taught for granted. Okay, don't just swallow it hook, line, and sinker. Think for yourself. Use your brain. Spot assumptions in the arguments. Look for circular reasoning. Have they actually established that evolution occurred, or are they assuming that evolution occurred? What is the actual raw data, the raw evidence actually saying? Does that necessitate you adopting an evolutionary model? And a great way to sort of think for yourself and to, sort of think, critically examine what's being taught is to go and read on your own time materials from credible people, credible scientists who have been critical of evolution, and see what they have to say, and then compare both, what you're learning in the classroom to what other credible scientists are saying, and see which is best, see which holds up the best. All right. So you can make up your own mind at the end of the day, but make sure that you're also exposing yourself to alternative views that might not be what you're hearing in the classroom. Okay. Because the classroom is almost for sure going to give you this pro-Darwin only dogmatic take on evolution that's censoring evidence from you. So unfortunately, it's kind of up to you to get to self-educate on your own time. That's the bad news. The good news is that the internet has made this super easy over the last few years. Or you can, people still read books, right? I think they do. There's some great books out there. So one of the books that I read when I was studying evolution in school, and I think it's still quite relevant, even though it was published in the year 2000, it's very relevant today, even to what is still being taught in schools, is a book titled Icons of Evolution by Jonathan Wells. And look, the science of evolution hasn't changed all that much in the last 23 years. So I still highly recommend Icons of Evolution if you want to learn about what the evidence really says about many of the common lines of evidence that are used to supposedly promote evolution in public schools. You read that book, Icons of Evolution by Jonathan Wells. There's also a lot of other great books out there. There's a textbook called Explore Evolution, which is basically a critique of the main lines of evidence that are used to support neo-Darwinism in many public school biology textbook. And so this, again, is a great way to get the other side of the story. I also wrote a textbook that's great for high school age students or even college age students. We don't recommend it for use in a public school classroom because at Discovery Institute, we actually don't think that we should be pushing ID into public schools, but it's a great textbook if you want to learn about the topic on your own free time. It's titled Discovering Intelligent Design. So look, if you got time to read a couple books, Icons of Evolution, Explore Evolution, Discovering Intelligent Design, those are great places to start to learn about some of the evidence that might not be discussed in your biology course. You can also go online, go to Discovery Institute's website. Our main ID website is just intelligentdesign.org. But from there, you can get to a lot of our other websites like evolutionnews.org, or our podcast, ID the Future, or our YouTube channel. We have a lot of fantastic videos, including very easy to follow animations or lectures by scientists about the evidence. And so I highly recommend going to our our YouTube channel for the Center for Science and Culture. Again, you can get these links if you go to intelligentdesign.org, and there's all kinds of resources there you can find.
Yeah, wonderful. Now, kind of based on kind of you saying that, I'm curious because, when I sometimes speak to students, and depending on how much time I have to get into it, I have like the super short, oversimplified answer and then, longer answers. And I'm curious if what I'm saying is actually true. I think it is, and you can tell me whether I'm right or wrong. But I say, often when you look at the evidence that's being presented in curriculum, it's kind of like with the Jonathan Wells icons of evolution. Some of it is just simply false. It just has been proven to be incorrect or proven false, and it's still being taught as true. Other types of evidence for evolution is just evidence for microevolution of small genetic changes within a species, like Darwin's finches, mutating bacteria, peppered moths, that sort of thing. And I would say, look, I accept that evidence that shows natural selection and genetic mutation. I believe those things all happen. It just doesn't point to a kind of a Darwinian macroevolution, common ancestry. The third type of evidence would be like fossil structures, similar DNA, homology, not only apes and humans, but across living creatures, and then, also, biogeographical evolution as well. And I would say, look, this can easily be explained by a common creator as well as a common ancestor. A common creator could make a similar, common ancestor make a similar. Now, which one makes the most sense? And so I'll kind of, follow up with saying, I've never seen a piece of evidence that points only to evolution that could not just as easily or better be explained by a common creator or intelligent designer. Is that fair to say, or is there something that you've seen like, wow, no, that's a really good piece of evidence that is not better or just as easily explained by a designer?
First of all, I think the summary that you just gave is fantastic, Ryan. When you look at the evidence, what do you see? Especially what's taught in public schools and in textbooks, you see either A, evidence that's just flat out wrong, B, evidence that, it is evidence for evolution, but it's microevolution. And the examples you gave, I agree 100%. Changes in finch beaks. Those finches on the Galapagos Islands, you might read in a textbook, that new species have evolved. But when you actually look at the scientific literature, you learn that these different finch species can actually interbreed with each other. That means they're not actually separate species, because the definition of a species is a reproductively isolated population. Okay. And that is not what you have with the Galapagos finches. So exactly. This would be evidence of microevolution, small scale change within a species. And I fully accept that. So is there evidence for evolution? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but the evidence that we have is what we would call evidence for small scale change, microevolution. So I have no problem with acknowledging that there is evidence for evolution out there. What we don't see is evidence for the origin of fundamentally new types of organisms or fundamentally new biological features. Stephen Meyer likes to say that, sort of at the micro level, where evolution really, where we draw the line, would be at the origin of new folds in proteins. Because new protein folds represent a new fundamentally different type of structure at the biochemical level that can do something totally new. And there's been a lot of research done on the evolvability of protein folds, which makes it look like it's very difficult for these structures to evolve, because protein folds tend to represent very, very rare sequences of amino acids. Proteins are basically long chains of amino acids that are then folded up into a very precise three-dimensional structure to do some important function in your body, okay? And it turns out that you have to have a very precise ordering of amino acids in many proteins in order to get a stable functional protein fold that can actually perform a function. So that precise ordering means that as soon as you start to incur lots of mutations, you're actually, those mutations either are not going to change the fold, or if they start to change the fold, then you destroy the function. It can't work anymore. And so the kinds of mutations that you get in proteins don't tend to give you new folds. And evolving these new folds, these new shapes essentially, is something that would be very, very difficult to do, because these sequences that yield functional protein folds are very rare and isolated in sequence space. So anyway, the point of this is that I think that the evidence that we see for evolution is small scale. And whenever we talk about evolving fundamentally new structures, the evidence is not there. There's also the evidence that you mentioned, Ryan, which is the evidence which, sure, maybe it could be explained by common ancestry, but could also be explained by design. Let me give a great example. The structure of the arms of vertebrates, or the limbs of vertebrates. We have a very particular bone pattern in our arms and legs. And it turns out that that bone pattern is shared by many other kinds of vertebrates, whether we're talking about a whale or a bird or a bat or a dog or a monkey, that many different kinds of vertebrates have a similar sort of basic bone structure in their limbs. So an evolutionist interprets this as if it is evidence for homology, similarity that is the result of common ancestry. But an ID theorist, and that's, I'm not saying that's impossible. I mean, that is one possibility. But the question we have to ask is that the only possibility? Are there other possible ways to explain why we have a similar bone structure in our arms besides, sharing a common ancestor with the common ancestor of other vertebrates? I would say yes, and that would be common design. It's also possible that we are designed based upon a common blueprint. And that's not just for arbitrary reasons. There are good functional reasons why a designer would reuse this bone structure over and over again in different types of organisms. It's because it's very versatile, it's very dexterous, it's very stable, it's very strong. It can be used for lots of different purposes. And so we can actually do studies on the bone structure in vertebrates and find that this is a very good design that actually makes sense to reuse in different organisms. And it's not just arbitrary, it actually is sort of a good rational design principle. And engineers do this all the time. Engineers will find a design that works, and then they will reuse that design in different technologies. We see wheels being used on both cars and airplanes. We see keyboards being used on cell phones and tablets and laptops. We see in computer programming. I had to write many thousands of lines of code during my PhD. I had to get into Python programming. And what we see in computer programming is that very frequently programmers will reuse coding modules that perform functions they need in different programs. And so in the same way, a designer who's functioning like essentially like a good engineer will reuse parts that work, coding modules that work in different designs, in different systems. And that's exactly what we see in living organisms. So the similarities that we see in living organisms don't necessarily reflect common ancestry. That could be a possibility in many cases, but it's not the only possibility. And by the way, one last point on this. There are many examples where we see similarities between organisms that cannot be explained by common ancestry. Evolutionary biologists recognize this. They actually have a name for it. They call it convergence or convergent evolution. Whenever you see an evolutionary scientist appealing to convergent evolution, the reason they are doing that is because we have discovered similar traits between different organisms that cannot be explained by appealing to inheritance from a common ancestor, okay? That is the actual reason why convergent evolution is invoked in every single case, okay? Sometimes they will also invoke loss of traits to explain the lack of traits that cannot be explained by inheritance from a common ancestor, okay? And convergence is ubiquitous. In fact, the leading evolutionary biologist, no friend of ID, Simon Conway Morris from the UK, he has said in quite a few of his writings in his books that convergence is quote unquote ubiquitous. Ubiquitous, of course, means everywhere, right? So literally convergent evolution is all over the place in biology. There are so many traits that cannot be explained through appealing, similar traits between different species that cannot be explained by appealing to a common ancestor. A good example of this would be the eyes of cephalopods, organisms like octopus or squid or cuttlefish. They have a very similar basic design to their eye to vertebrates. It's basically a camera eye. There are some differences, but the fundamental design of the cephalopod eye is very similar to the design of the vertebrate eye. Yet, we don't even know if the common ancestor of cephalopods and vertebrates, we don't even know if it had an eye. We have no idea what its eye looked like. There's no reason to think that the common ancestor of mollusks and vertebrates, cephalopods are a type of mollusk, there's no reason to think that that common ancestor had a camera type eye. So what they have to invoke is convergent evolution, where just by chance, these two very, very different kinds of organisms stumbled upon a very similar design, a very similar structure, and this is just by chance. Now, of course, Richard Dawkins will say, oh, well, this is evidence for natural selection because selection will shape things that are exposed to similar selection pressures in similar ways. Okay, fine. But, you have to ask the question, now, if two things are similar, then that's evidence for common ancestry. But if they're similar and you can explain it by common ancestry, fine. If they're similar and you can't explain it by common ancestry, now that's just evidence for convergent evolution. So in what way are we actually saying that evolution is testable, right? If whether you can explain the similarity through common ancestry or not, either way, now it's evidence for evolution. And I think this sort of puts evolution in an unfalsifiable position and really shows that the methodology that is used to infer common ancestry is based upon assumptions. So again, I keep saying my last point, but let me just say this, right? So, getting back to thinking critically, when you're studying evolution in school and you're shown some evolutionary tree, what biologists call phylogenetic trees, okay? Ask the question, is that evolutionary tree raw data, or is it the result of a particular way of interpreting the data that's based perhaps upon assumptions? What assumptions went in to that construction of that phylogenetic tree? I can tell you what assumptions went into the construction of that tree because they are admitted in the evolutionary literature. When evolutionary scientists construct phylogenetic trees, they assume their primary assumption is that similarity is the result of common ancestry, except for when it isn't, and then you have to invoke convergent evolution. But we'll put that aside for a second. They assume, and it's just an assumption, that biological similarity reflects common ancestry. They completely ignore and don't even think about the possibility of common design. And when there's evidence that doesn't fit the tree, they don't put, when there's similarity that can't be explained by common ancestry, they don't put common ancestry on the table for falsification. They just invoke sort of secondary explanations like convergent evolution, or there's many other, what we call ad hoc epicycles, auxiliary hypotheses that are invoked by evolutionary biologists to explain away data that doesn't fit into the evolutionary tree. Convergent evolution is just one of them. There's incomplete lineage sorting. There's horizontal gene transfer. There's long branch attraction. I mean, I can go down the list. There's a bunch of different mechanisms that they will use, and sometimes they might be, viable explanation. Who am I to say? All I'm saying is this: common descent is not on the table for falsification, because whenever the evidence doesn't fit with an evolutionary tree, they just invoke these auxiliary hypotheses to explain away why the data didn't fit with the predictions of common ancestry. But, you study evolution, they're not going to say this to you. You've got to read books by Jonathan Wells, read books by Stephen Meyer, watch the videos, watch lectures by Paul Nelson. He's very good at explaining this. I've got quite a few lectures out there. You've got to do your homework on your own to understand that a lot of evolutionary claims are based upon assumptions, and that those assumptions really don't hold up when you really test them.
Yeah. And I'll be seeing Paul Nelson here in just a couple of weeks out at Summit Ministries. He'll be there for this session instead of you, since he'll be overseas. Here's what I think is just fascinating man, there's such a short amount of time. Here's what I want to go with this, because there's one other aspect I wanted to touch on, and we mentioned in a high school student, right? It's like, hey, just learn, just ask questions and learn. What happens though when you get to maybe the college level? You're someone, maybe a Christian, and you believe in some sort of intelligent design. You're studying in the sciences. You're maybe a graduate student or even a professor. What sort of academic freedom is there then to actually do research and submit papers contrary to kind of that evolutionary paradigm? What kind of advice would you have for those who are actually wanting to now put their kind of foot in the game? They want to get in the game. They want to start producing and researching stuff that is contrary to maybe what their school or the program that they're studying within holds to.
Yeah, sure. So Ryan, I mean, it's hard to give one size fits all answers to this because everybody's in a different place and every department is different. But I will say that in general, we have unfortunately experienced and observed that if you are an ID-friendly scientist or a student, or whether you're an undergraduate or graduate student, or maybe you're a postdoc or a junior faculty member who's not tenured yet, even if you're tenured, that there are risks to your academic freedom if you openly support intelligent design or sort of critique the standard evolutionary view. And this is really unfortunate because it means that, basically you have to keep your head down and keep your mouth shut, and you're not allowed to actually, ask hard questions. You're not allowed to actually, express your views or do research openly that might challenge evolution or support intelligent design. We deal with this all the time. I mean, part of my job is actually to provide, help with defending scientists who are experiencing this persecution and lack of academic freedom because of their support for intelligent design. So my advice to folks in this situation is, number one, to keep your heads down. Number two, to find like-minded people who maybe think the way you do, so you don't feel isolated, you don't feel like you're all alone. And there are a lot of great folks in the ID community who do think like you do, and many of them have their own sort of unfortunate, persecution, suffering type experiences to share. So you'll be in good company with people who understand what you might be going through. A great way to do that, especially if you are a student, whether undergraduate, graduate student or even recent graduate, is to attend Discovery Institute's summer seminar on intelligent design. We have a great program for students to come and learn about ID from some of the top scientists in the field. And you'll also get connected to a much larger network of people who sort of share your views. So reach out to us at Discovery Institute if you are finding yourself caught up in an academic freedom situation. We've got a lot of experience helping people. I wish we didn't have so much experience, but we do have a lot of experience helping people in those situations, and we can help you, think through what the right thing to do is, and how to basically survive in academia as an ID proponent.
Yeah, no, that's so helpful. And I think that's, I've sensed a hesitation from students as I was a high school teacher for 12 years. And I've spoken at conferences on science and faith and had students come to me. It's like, but can I go into the sciences as a Christian? Like, can I even do that? Because they often hear things like, I have a quote from Dawkins. It's like, you cannot, or I forget, maybe it was Sam Harris, but you cannot be a scientist and a Christian at the same time. You kind of got to pick. And that's my story in kind of entering into doing apologetic speaking. I was wanting to get into speaking, and I had a youth group approach me and say, hey, can you speak on the topic of science and faith? Because we had a student that just graduated, went off to freshman year of college, came back at Christmas break, one semester, and said, you can't be a Christian and a scientist at the same time. I'm choosing science. I'm leaving the church, and told that to all the youth group kids. And they were like shocked, like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? And so it's just so common to have this hesitation, this uneasiness of wanting to go into the sciences. But I think that the Discovery Institute provides so many resources for students to encourage them to go into that. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, and thanks so much for what you just said, Ryan. And let me just say, you can be a Christian in the sciences, okay? Yeah. You can even be a Christian who if you're a theistic evolutionist, by the way, you're going to catch almost no flack, because basically they tolerate you quite happily if you pose no threat to their creation story. Yeah. So again, I'm not here to. I understand that even my friends in the Christian community who are theistic evolutionists, they do face some of their own challenges as a Christian in the scientific community, but it's a lot easier. I'll just tell you that, okay? Yeah. But even if you're a Darwin skeptic or an ID proponent, and I say this because I have friends who are theistic evolutionists who have told me this. It's so much easier, it'd be so much harder if I was an ID proponent, and so that might even factor in sometimes to why they take that view. But that aside, I think that if you are a supporter of ID, it is possible to be a scientist in the mainstream scientific community. But I think you need to also find friends who think the way you do. It's going to be a lot easier, and you're also going to get a lot of advice as to sort of how to be an undercover or in the closet ID proponent, and then knowing when it's the right time to come out of the closet. Get good advice and surround yourself with people who have a lot of experience. But it's very possible. If you love science and you're a Christian, don't be discouraged, okay? Yep. And find other people who are like, there's a lot of Christians in the sciences. Find other people who think like you, or if you're a theist of any background, whatever your background is, don't be discouraged. And know that there's a lot of other people like you in the sciences.
Yeah. Appreciate it. That is a wonderful encouragement there at the end. And so thank you, Casey, so much for taking this time after COVID, right before your trip. It's a crazy moment, but thank you for taking this time to help all of those listening and watching understand intelligent design and how to come up against some of the cultural challenges to holding an intelligent design perspective today. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Ryan. It was fun.
All right, everybody, I hope this is such an encouragement and a blessing to you and equipping you to engage the culture well and engage these ideas of science and faith. Again, let me recommend this book, The Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith, co-edited by William Dempsey, Casey Luskin, and Joseph Hold'em. I am in conversation with other contributors to this book to discuss their chapters and tackle more issues, science and faith. So if you have other questions on this topic that you want to see discussed, let me know, send me a message. Otherwise, again, I'm going to be taking about 2 weeks off as I head off to Summit Ministries and serve on faculty there. There won't be videos coming, but I have a schedule for the end of August and September and into October already. So you can check that out and see my schedule at think-well.org. You can see the wealth of other videos that are going to pop up right over here to engage other ideas relevant to the Christian faith and continue to help you think well about Christianity and in cultural engagement. And so continue to think deeply about these things. Think about God, Christianity, and Jesus, because they are worth thinking about. See you next time, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.